Specifically early in my career, I did things for a reason because I was pursuing a specific outcome. I would try to build startups that would be successful. There's a lot of money flowing here and stuff like that. Barkbox was me stumbling into building something really fun with people I really liked. And we didn't really know what we were doing, but it just got momentum. The whole company and the culture was just fueled by what would be really fun to do.
This is Henrik Werdelin. He is an entrepreneur and author best known for co-founding Barkbox, which is also listed on the New York Stock Exchange. He also started Prehype, which creates new ventures such as Barkbox and Co. and Row. And as of late, Henrik has dived deep into the world of AI. I first met Henrik when I worked at Hot Potato, which was eventually acquired by Facebook. He was an advisor to the company. And as I got to know him, he is someone I admire, not only in business, but also how he approaches his philosophy in life. So I invited him on the podcast to discuss pursuing interests rather than setting goals, how he utilizes AI to develop his ideas, and we dive deep into the topic of longevity. We also discuss his 9+1 framework, which is a tool that he uses for life planning. This was a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Welcome to the Carnage Capricorn Show. I'm an entrepreneur, a podcast investor, collector, runner, partner, and parent. Most people know me as the founder of Skillshare. As I approached my 40th birthday, I found myself at a crossroads. So I embarked on a year-long sabbatical to rediscover what makes life truly fulfilling. This podcast is a personal journey to explore how we can thrive in all aspects of life, from work and family to relationships, hobbies, and beyond. In each episode, I'll explore novel ideas that challenge our own perspectives. Whether you're seeking inspiration, practical advice, or just curious, join me on this journey, and welcome to the show. To kick it off, I asked Henrik about his thoughts on open-endedness, which is a concept developed from AI. At its core, open-endedness embodies exploration without a predefined destination, a crucial trait for both entrepreneurial endeavors and the pursuit of artificial general intelligence. For entrepreneurs, this is akin to following the most exciting path, which Henrik believes has the potential to yield more interesting outcomes. Here's him explaining the concept.
I've always had that phrase in my mind, like I like to build cool shit with people I like. And that's been my North Star. And I have, for the longest time, been trying to find cool analogies or other people that was trying to express the same type of philosophy that I feel I have about my career and being an entrepreneur. So I've invoked these stories about the people who meet and play jazz music in the ping pong club, Fat Cats in New York. And I tried all these different stories, and nothing really resonated. And then for some reason, I stumbled over Kenneth Stanley's book, My Greatest Complete Planet. The book is about how we get to artificial general intelligence. And so it's not necessarily a book about entrepreneurial philosophy, but I think it applies to it. And what that book basically says is that instead of pursuing goals, if you want to do something extraordinary, you should be collecting what he refers to as interestingness as stepping stones, and then put those stepping stones out in front of you. And if you wander on those stepping stones of interestingness, the goal will take care of itself. He called them open-endedness systems. And he used stories of culture and great innovations and how they were all randomly discovered by people with intensity was pursuing something else. That very much resonated with how I like to build. I've been quite obsessed about that book recently.
I found this pretty interesting. This is counter to what I was taught as an entrepreneur, which is finding the biggest market opportunity and building a unicorn or billion-dollar company within that market. Henrik then shares a story about how his thinking was pretty similar to mine and how it has evolved over the years.
Specifically early in my career, I did things for a reason because I was pursuing a specific outcome. I would try to build startups that would be successful. There's a lot of money flowing here and stuff like that. Barkbox was me stumbling into building something really fun with people I really liked. And we didn't really know what we were doing, but it just got momentum. The whole company and the culture was just fueled by what would be really fun to do. And so when I meet people or get exposed to a project, I basically gut check, is this something that gets me excited? Yes or no? If it doesn't get me excited, I'm like, yeah, probably not. And if it is, then I do it. The problem is, of course, how do you make sure that you're not just wasting your time? There's definitely a sense of intensity that you need to apply to it. I find more and more often now that some of these things end up laddering into something great.
This is such a novel idea, and it's so backwards to how I think about building companies. So when I first talked to Henrik about it, I found it really hard to understand how this actually manifests. How does one build an iconic company without focusing on the outcome, without setting a goal, without working backwards from that? So I asked Henrik about this. He mentioned that energy is a huge component. He follows what gets him excited. And he also has a belief around how companies should be built.
And so I think I do it in two ways. I do it how energetic I do, but I honestly find that a lot of my energy comes from people around me. And so
Same.
I'll pitch it to you and you go like, oh, out of these three ideas, that one is a really good idea. It's like, yeah, I really like that idea too. And I think it's just by osmosis, I get the spillover energy is what kind of drags me that way. I basically believe that people built the size of company that they deserve to build. If you're a teacher and you are incredible, you end up building Khan Academy, right? You stumble into it because your originality and your intensity and your gravity and all these properties that makes you amazing ladders into something that becomes better. And so I'm not sure I quite believe it because I also described to it Andreessen Horowitz idea of like you can pick a founder or market to pick a market. And so I get that too. But I do think sometimes that we have the illusion that we can predict the next 10 years and you just never can. You just have to kind of work with a spirit of making is thinking. So you have to be creating. If you do that and you constantly create optionality for yourself, then once luck kind of come by, you have something that you can use to latch onto. I'm much less worried if it becomes big, and I'm more worried of it never getting any early traction.
I never heard that before. You build the size of company that you deserve to build. Obviously, there's luck and timing that comes into play. But for the most part, if you follow what's interesting, you just have to believe that it's going to ladder up into something amazing. Henrik does make a good point around hunting for problems and not for ideas. My personal process has always been focusing on ideas and then backing that into the problem set. And if it doesn't seem like a big problem to solve, I'll just throw it in the trash and move on to the next idea. That got me thinking about flipping my process backwards to follow how he approaches searching for ideas, which he explains here.
I think you win a lot with intensity, and the only way you can have intensity is to be excited, because otherwise other people will be able to do the same thing. I don't really care that much about ideas. I'm in the hunt of problems, and I find them to be much better starting points. The Prehype methodology that we developed, but what is the group that I can be bothered talking to? And it tends to be somebody who's either close to me or something that's very relevant to me, like my kids, myself. And then I start to go into problems identification mode, which is basically, I have this kind of like post-it notes. It sucks that, right? I just constantly think about stuff that sucks for those people. Once I have a good list of problems, ideas just become thesis statements to how to make that unsuck. And the thesis statements, then I think about either viable or non-viable. So I don't
Mhm.
render judgment. And my wife is a molecular biologist, and she kind of talks about her experiments being non-viable. And I go like, so they failed. And she's like, yeah, they're just non-viable. There's not like an emotion to the experiment not working. It's just like had a thesis, didn't work, moved on to the next thing. And so that's kind of like how I laddered things up. What's the affinity group? What's the problem? What's the thesis statement? Test the thesis statement. Doesn't work. Next, super unemotional about it. It's easier for me to get excited about a problem than it is about getting excited about necessarily a solution.
Yeah. That's a really good point about being unemotional to the idea or the problem set. And I found it interesting that he got more excited about solving problems than he did about the actual solution, which is very counter to how most people approach developing their own ideas. So that piqued my curiosity around his own process. How many ideas is he exploring at the same time? How does he track all of them? So I asked him, and here's his answer.
I have this notepad I call Inklings, and they have big thoughts of originality. And often I don't know if it becomes a blog post or a company or a cool statement in a conversation, but they're just like nuggets of interestingness. And I probably have 10, 15 of those going at all time. Because you asked, and I was reading about this morning, I guess it's super personal, but I have never done deep work with a therapist or a coach. I'm
Okay.
super fascinated about it, but just never had the opportunity to meet somebody. I ran into this amazing world-known coach, and we were talking about AI. Now, obviously, he asked pointed questions in the conversation and got me into a book that he referred me to, which is really about coping mechanisms that different people have when they get overwhelmed. And so I start to read that. And so one of the things I'm fascinated by right now is these coping strategies. But what I'll do then, I'll just start to read more and I'll tinker. And I went down that kind of coach thing. And then I started to think about a new way of constructing a bot platform to extend the impact of workshops. And so I just like jump from one to the next. But that's a few examples of what happened today.
That's probably something I should do a little bit more of, is tracking just these little nuggets of inspiration, or what Henrik describes as just interesting things. I tend to capture business ideas or just random thoughts for content, but I can definitely expand that into capturing a lot more. Henrik is spending a lot of his time with AI, so I then asked him, how does he use AI to explore these ideas that he's thinking through?
So I would say the most effective use case now is I'm somewhat philosophical and I say a lot of words, and sometimes that is not very useful for anybody else. After this conversation, I'll have 2 or 3 thoughts, and I would
Yeah.
probably just grab my phone and open OpenAI, and I'll just talk like stream of conscious into it. Then JCS like write me up a memo in this structure that I created, and then I'll start to mine it for inklings and other stuff. I mean, a lot of times it's actually not necessarily the structure, it's the condensing of the thought.
Mm.
And so it does for me a pretty decent job of putting kind of like a lot of word vomit into bullet points. In the past, I used to, well, I work with people who I feel often are very good of taking random philosophical shit that I say out loud and then play it back, but it's much better when they say it. And often I didn't mean that thing at all. They just picked up something that was smarter in the process. And I honestly think sometimes OpenAI does a little bit the same. It just takes the words and goes like, "Did you mean?" And you're like, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea."
From there, we switch gears from business to life. I was curious about how Henrik approaches his health and his approach to longevity. We are a few years apart in age, and this is something that we've both been diving into with our free time. He was a lot farther along than me in the process, so I wanted to learn what he was up to, what he's tried, and what advice he would give me as someone that was embarking on this journey.
I got introduced to a physician called Dr. Kamate, who's been working in this space for a while. She'd helped me through the journey of, I think, to start with just kind of accepting that we all have genetic markups and we have lifestyles, and that to our own devices, there's a pretty big chance that's going to end up in a not good place. And so the big ones, of course, the ones we know, like having a heart attack or being diabetic, I kind of just became keen on measuring some of these things and accepting that, kind of getting used to looking at medical data and not get super worried because there's always something a little bit wrong. I've started to measure biomarkers and have an idea what my baseline is and where I do seem to have stuff that I have to fix. I and most Danish people have high cholesterol. That's just something
Mhm.
that runs in our culture and something that we then need to figure out how you best work with. And of course, there's diet and there's pills. I think I've started to do that. The second thing, which is contrarian and maybe, I hope I'm not polarizing, but I have always seen meds as being a declaration of failure. I've seen it as if I could not lower my cholesterol, even going vegan, then it was probably because I was non-compliant. Like, and I think comes from kind of growing up and always being on the big side, not being able to get the biometrics that you want is often associated with you not being compliant. And now my perspective is that if somebody told you that you had to wear glasses, nobody would say, "Oh, you should just squint your eyes more." You just be like, "Oh, I have a genetic markup. My eyes are messed up in this way, and I'm putting glasses on." And some medications and some protocols and some interventions I now see through the lens of glasses, but the inside, rather than being, I'm a failure for not being able to adjust enough to be optimal.
So this seems obvious, but that point really struck a chord. I'm someone that doesn't take a lot of medicine. I try not to even take aspirin if I ever get a headache. And I always looked at medicine as a failure of not maintaining healthy. Now I'm realizing there's no amount of lifestyle change that you can make if some of the health risks that you have are genetic. And modern day medicine is a great tool to mitigate that risk. So I also got my biomarkers done. And similar to Henrik, I have pretty high cholesterol. Majority of that is genetics. So I asked him about what he learned from getting his biomarkers done and how he's approaching high cholesterol and mitigating his risk around heart disease.
I knew that I probably had high cholesterol. I'm 48 now, and it's probably the first time I looked at it was like 39. My family has it. My dad had a heart attack and survived. And my dad, when he was 60, had pressure in his chest and his left hand was tickling. And then my stepmom was smart enough to say, "We're going to the hospital." And he was like, "No, I'm sure." I played a lot of golf the other day, so probably that. And I was driving to the hospital and they put him on a stress test bicycle and then he had a heart attack there. But then he
Wow.
got a stent and then he's literally was playing golf 2 days later. In our world, it's kind of like a non-event. But the reality is he had a heart attack, and had he been somewhere else, he would have died. I kind of knew that happened, and because I was running the big side, I was kind of like, "Yeah, you're fattish, so therefore, like, you probably have something because you shouldn't have eaten as much." I remember the first cholesterol biomarker test I took in New York was with one of those mail-in services. I didn't even want the pressure from my physician to kind of tell me what you had to do. And then I started to do all this research. And then finally I went to my physician and I was like, "You should probably test my cholesterol." And then I checked it and he goes like, "It's high." And it's like, "But I'm really working on it. I think I'll get it down." He goes like, "Yeah, try to get it down." And then worked on it for 3 months and for 6 months and nothing happened. And then he goes like, "So," because like, "What else can we do?" Right. And so problem, of course, is that the web makes all thoughts available. And with something with high cholesterol, you will have many perspectives guiding you. You do your research, find people you trust more than others, and then you make a decision and live with that. And that's kind of where I've ended up. Now, I've now
Got it.
gone on the other end. Like, I will take any meds now pretty much because I'm like, throw me the glasses, it'll be fine. So I probably went like a little bit to the other side of it, but that's not completely true. I I respect that all there's not a medication that does not have a side effect. And so I know where high cholesterol ends. And I've gotten the CT scan of my heart and I've seen that the arteries already like closing. And so I know where that story ends. And now I just kind of like try to figure out how can I best mitigate it and prolong that event to happen. I just did my own research and took my own decision,
Got
and
it.
I don't try to project that to anybody else. But you're right, like, we don't talk that much about it.
So I'm glad that Henrik shared that story and was open about his own risks for heart disease. And after hearing that, I thought it was just generally good advice. Do your own research. You're going to get a lot of information overload. There's going to be so many contradicting statements around what's good for you and what's not. And at a certain point, you just have to make a decision and move on with your life. And that's what I needed to hear from that conversation, considering what I was thinking through and what I was going through as well.
It is super scary. I mean, I just tried to I would like to prolong having real health issues for as long as possible with the naive idea that innovation works so fast that if I can just
Yes.
push it ahead, then they can fix most things.
So after we talked about longevity, I asked him about his 8+1 framework. I'll link this in the show notes, but it's a framework that he uses to plan out his life. And I first read about it in an article, and it's something that I adopted and use myself. While I don't use the same buckets that he does, I generally use the same framework around 8+1. So I asked him to explain the framework in detail.
The A+1 framework is a way to think about how you get the most out of your life by identifying the 8 parts of at least my life that I thought was important, and then thinking about how to get the most out of it by thinking about how much resources you put in and what is the value you get out. And it was born out of me going on a sabbatical and just writing down like endless amount of notebooks about what was important and then percolating it into this. Then we can go through the plus one is about being thoughtful about those 8 boxes. Instead of just saying there's things that are important in my life, you actually spend real time and energy thinking about how much in balance they are and what are experiments that you could apply so that you can level up your output from some of these boxes. Now, I think what it also is it's acknowledgement that a rich life for me means that I am pretty good at 8 things, but I probably will never be the best of any of them. There will be people out there that will perform better on some aspects of life. I choose to be a B plus player across the whole thing rather than being an A's in one. So the first one is transact. It's about making enough capital and cash flow to make sure that you can sustain your life and care for your family. The second is invest, which is really about thinking cognitively about how do you make things that have compounding value over time. The third thing is assist. So how do you help people or courses? And then you have learn, which is about trying to understand what your output is and how do you become better of producing that at high scale in high quality. Then you have health, which is basically we talked about body and the mind, the hardware and the software. Then you have family, being a good dad, being a good son, being a good family member. You have relationships, which is something that sounds a little bit odd, but I do think that you become who you surround yourself of. And so by being purposeful on your relationships, I think you get a richer life. And the last thing is ego or self kindness. Allocate time to make sure that you take care of yourself. And then plus one is I look at it every day, but I then once a week have a dedicated time where I sit down, I make a quick kind of mental note of all the boxes. If there's something that is out of whack, I try to brainstorm methods of becoming better at one of them and have a little database with all my different experiments.
So, this is a good framework for thriving in all different areas of your life. But I then asked him, how does he juggle all the different balls? What happens if he gets stressed out or if the balls drop? So, there are only so many hours in the day. So, how does he juggle all the different priorities that he sets throughout his year?
I mostly get worried when I feel that I'm so busy or caught up in stuff that there's stuff that I'm dropping, but I don't know what it is. I think get more worried when I either is not aware that one of the plates is about to fall or don't even know that there's a plate there to start with. And so
Hmm.
I think what have happened is that I've been more calm about the whole living. I think the second thing is that inside that there are people that's going to be better at each of these boxes. And the mental model I have is that every time I see somebody and I get envious on something that they've done, I basically say to myself, well, if you want to swap, you have to swap with the whole package. You have to swap all
Hmm.
8 boxes. You can't just swap one. And the
Oh,
reality is, if I look at the people that I admire in different boxes, I often wouldn't swap the whole set. I would only swap one. So it gives me comfort that I'm living a meaningful life.
so one of the boxes that I found pretty interesting was his ego box or the me box. So I asked him to dive a little bit deeper into explaining that and what that actually entails.
We have busy lives, all of us, and I feel often there's a lot of pull for your time. I
Hmm.
think this idea of saying I'm just going for a walk or I really enjoy playing padel or whatever it is, then giving yourself permission to do that without kind of feeling guilt is, at least for me, part of like taking care of myself. Honestly, if you start to crack, then everything cracks. Specifically, if somebody runs a company, then the way that you walk into the office, a lot of people is going to mirror that energy. And so I almost like see it as a responsibility to make sure that you're fully recovered. If you went out doing a marathon and the next day you were sore, most people go, you should need to recover, like your legs are fried.
Hmm. Yeah.
Now, if you've had like a marathon work life and you kind of like feel you need to be fried out on the sofa for half an hour, at least for me, I would feel guilty because like I want to play with my kids. So it's okay to say, you know what, I'm recovering. I mean, like I need 30 minutes.
And speaking of kids, I read that he used AI to create personalized bedtime stories. And this is something I often think about when I read books too. So I asked him about it.
I mean, like, what actually what I like most about that story is that I am keen to teach my kids some of the tools that I now have to control my mind,
Hmm.
like cognitive behavioral theory and stuff like that. And so what I will do sometimes is, let's say my son is scared of spiders. I'll make a bedtime story, but I'll ask GPT to write something in about how he conquer his fear of spiders based on cognitive behavioral theory kind of
Oh, wow.
principles. And he'll write a story, and you could just see how it's like will go like, and then it wouldn't be like this, but like then it will labor the emotion, and then it would do like
Yeah.
catastrophizing, and you can just see how it does. I like it for that. I use it in the same way we talked earlier for most things where I can, right? Anything from I need to come up with like something to do with my son next weekend to understand the conflict in Ukraine. And so what I will often do is I'll take a newspaper article that I thought was insightful and I would literally go, please explain this article to a 9-year-old. And it'll write it. And to the point now where he himself has started to have that behavior. And so sometimes he will go and say, can
Wow.
we ask AI to do it? He got into a fascinating game the other day where he was using Pi .ai, which is a little bit, I think, better as a conversational model as OpenAI is right now. And then he went down like a whole rabbit hole of role playing with it, and where he had to pretend that they were in the Second World War and create like this whole little interactive story, which I found fascinating.
So that was my conversation with Henrik. We talked about exploring things that you find exciting instead of goals, longevity, how he uses AI to explore his ideas, and also how he uses AI to create personalized bedtime stories for his kids. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, and I'll see you in the next episode.